The dampness of the night enveloped Kilkenny like a suffocating gloom as it faded into the dark streets. Whispers circulated. There is a woman who has emerged with her wealth, her marriages, her mysterious secrets. But who was this woman? Had Alice Kyteler truly sold her soul to the devil? Or was the story of a powerful woman merely a plaything of jealousy and intrigue? What would determine her fate? The harsh verdict of the court, or her own intelligence and courage? What could a woman sacrifice in her time to survive? And most importantly, could this woman be saved? Here we go. In the middle of the dark night, a door creaked in the room. The old smell of wood seemed to permeate the room. The flickering flames of the candle on the table reflected on the walls. Alice stepped in front of the mirror, examining her thick hair and pale skin. Finally, she looked into her eyes. They held both the sparkle of defiant strength and the weariness of a difficult life. And then these words fell from her lips. Will it be God who judges me, or the greed of men? That night, there was a frost outside, the air as cold as a sharp knife. The barking of dogs mingled with the ringing of church bells in the streets. It was as if the city's cries for help could be heard. Yet the streets were so quiet that no one heard these cries. And this silence was a harbinger of the approaching storm. In the narrow, cobbled streets of Kilkenny, as the creaking wheels of merchant carts echoed through the air, a little girl squeezed her father's hand tighter in fear as she made her way through the crowd. Alice was only 10 years old. Despite her youth, she was very observant. It was as if she had already begun to analyze the city's commercial atmosphere and the allure of gold and silver at an early age. When they reached the market square, she looked around. The scent of spices wafted from the bales of fabric on some stalls. Cinnamon, cloves, pepper ... Alice took a deep breath. To her mind, these scents meant not only wealth, but also freedom. Instead of stepping aside and waiting quietly like the other women in the market, her mother asked prices, haggled, and walked side by side with her father. Alice watched this with admiration. One evening, sitting in front of the fireplace with her mother, she said to her, "Mother, one day I will speak as freely as you do. No one will be able to tell me to be quiet." Her mother smiled slightly, but there was concern in her eyes. "My daughter, this is a world that does not want to hear women's voices. If you raise your voice, they will shout even louder to drown you out." That night, the first spark fell into Alice's heart. The spark of a woman who did not want to be silenced. When Alice was a young woman, her name began to be mentioned in Kilkenny in connection with trade and potential opportunities. The determined and sharp look in her eyes drew attention not only for her beauty, but also for her intelligence. When she married the wealthy merchant William Outlaw, everyone knew this marriage would change her life. But no one could have predicted that Alice would become not just a wife, but also a partner. On the wedding night, the hall was filled with a veritable feast. Large crystal chandeliers lit up the room like fire. Round tables were laden with food, wine, and fruit. Glasses clinked, and the aroma of roasted meats and wine wafted through the air. Alice caught the whispered murmurs of some court ladies. "She's so lucky to have married such a wealthy man. She doesn't deserve it. But she's too clever. That's not a good sign. Time will tell what will happen to William Outlaw." Alice smiled, raised her head, and turned her eyes to her husband. William was not just a husband to her. He was a bridge to wealth and fame. After hearing the whispers that night, she thought to herself, "No one can dictate my destiny. The path to gold will always lead to me." After marrying William Outlaw, Alice began to learn which routes the merchant caravans took. Fabrics, spices, silver coins. With her sharp wit, business became easier, trade grew, and her home was practically overflowing with possessions. The townspeople began to mention her name with both admiration and envy. But there is always a balance in life. Just as every rise has a fall, especially the rise of a woman. Her husband, William Outlaw, one of the leading figures in trade, suddenly fell ill on a mild, breezy autumn night. He was overcome by heavy coughing and a fever that consumed his body. This illness confined him to bed within a few days. Various healers were summoned from outside the city. Rare herbs were found and boiled. Prayers were recited, but nothing helped. When William finally succumbed to all this and breathed his last, rumors began to circulate in the streets of Kilkenny. Alice poisoned her husband to get his fortune. His death left Alice a young widow, but it also made her one of the richest and most talked about women in the city. As the years passed, Alice's life had entered a cycle enveloped in wealth, fame, and power. The experience and wealth she gained after her first marriage were decisive in her subsequent choice of husband. In 1302, she married Adam Blund. Although she had no children from this marriage, Blund's inheritance issues from his previous marriage presented Alice with difficulties. One afternoon, Alice was sitting in the stone courtyard of her house. She saw her stepchildren watching her from the window of one of the rooms. There were silent threats in their gaze. Alice sighed quietly. "Every step I take, every decision I make, will always be perceived as a threat in their eyes." Soon after, Adam LeBlund fell ill with a relentless disease. His increasing tremors at night and days of exhaustion led to a sudden death, and whispers similar to those heard after Alice's first husband's death began circulating again. Alice must have poisoned her second husband too, for fame and more money. Then, when she married Richard de Ledrede for the third time, Alice's fortune grew exponentially. However, Richard also fell ill unexpectedly and passed away within a few days, causing the suspicions to grow even stronger. Richard's sudden death exposed Alice to the cold, forbidding stone walls of courtrooms and the hateful, angry stares of her stepchildren. The process she initiated to claim her legal rights unleashed a storm of rage and resentment. When her fourth marriage took place, with John Le Poer present, Alice attracted not only the power of her fortune, but also the attention of dark political forces. Now the hateful glances of the stepchildren and the suspicious eyes of the churchgoers hovered over Alice like a dark shadow. Alice had to stand firm as a rock. The moment she showed the slightest sign of weakness, all arrows would be aimed at her. Alice's every step required intelligence and courage. That night, sitting by the fireplace, she thought to herself, "This game will not end with just fame and inheritance. I will see who is plotting behind my back and who is by my side." As the terrifying howl of the wind outside shook the roof of the house, Alice's heart was filled with both the fear of the unknown and the strength of her resolve. These marriages showed that she was not just a woman hunting for wealth. She was also a powerful woman, even a target. Kilkenny's cold stone walls silently echoed the screams of family conflicts. When Alice stepped into the courtrooms to claim her widow's rights after Richard de Ledrede's sudden death, a terrible storm was raging inside the house. Her stepchildren fixed their eyes on her, filled with anger and hatred. That evening, the silence in the large hall of the house was broken. The stepson's footsteps echoed on the wooden floorboards. He slowly approached Alice. "Mother, you are trying to take our inheritance. You must give us back the fortune that is rightfully ours." Alice slowly closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then, with deliberate movements, she fixed her gaze on her son's eyes. "You may be my enemies, but justice must be served through me. I will not back down in the face of any threat." At that moment, the maid Petronilla came from the kitchen, walking with anxious steps. The smell of wood and food filled the hall. Petronilla whispered in Alice's ear, "Madam, the children are very angry. What shall we do?" Alice crossed her legs and shook her head decisively. "No matter what happens, I will protect my rights, and no one will silence me." These conflicts were the first steps in Alice's struggle to protect not only her fortune, but also her reputation and freedom. Every inheritance case brought with it rumors and accusations. In the streets of Kilkenny, the whispers grew louder. That woman ... Alice. She's a witch, poisoning and killing her husbands, acquiring her wealth through dishonest means. Alice heard these words, but she remained steadfast, refusing to utter a single word. These inheritance and family conflicts would soon lead her down a much darker and more deadly path. But no one could have foreseen this, not even Alice. The gloomy and bitterly cold winter days of 1324 had blanketed Kilkenny's stone streets in a layer of gray. The cold in the city turned breath into misty smoke, and the terrible howling of the wind passed like a shadow between the houses, instilling fear in everyone's hearts. The whispers around were no longer coming only from the stepchildren. The priests and nuns in the church and the townspeople were also talking about Alice's terrible life. Bishop Richard de Ledrede of Ossory, sent to Kilkenny years earlier by Pope John XXII, had finally decided to pursue Alice's case. Known for his severity, this bishop turned his cold gaze towards Alice's home in the bitterly cold and freezing winter of 1324. Amidst the shadows of holy books, candles, and ancient symbols, the accusations against Alice spread rapidly. She rejects the Christian faith, sacrifices animals, and performs satanic rituals. Alice stared at the courtroom's intimidating cold stone walls and silently thought to herself, "These are not the shadows of my deeds, but the terrifying echoes of my power and wealth. But they won't scare me." The day of the trial arrived. That day, the courtroom was filled with the people's fearful whispers. Alice's loyal maid, Petronilla, looked at her with fearful eyes. She leaned close to her ear and whispered, "My lady, please stay calm, otherwise." Alice suddenly silenced Petronilla so no one else could hear and shook her head. "They cannot silence me, but you must be careful." The bishop's stern voice echoed through the courtroom. "Alice Kyteler, you are charged with heresy and witchcraft. Do you deny these charges?" Alice stood tall and replied, "I am innocent. I deny these charges. But know this, a clever and strong woman always finds her own way." Outside, the terrifying howl of the wind mingled with the solemn silence of the courtroom. Everyone expected Alice to be frightened and flee, but with her intelligence and determination, she was about to write her own destiny. As the court proceedings grew increasingly cruel, Alice's heart was filled with determination and anger. The sound of bells echoing between the stone walls and the howling wind outside were both frightening and spurring her plans on. Alice now knew there was no escape. She had to get away from here. At midnight, as the moonlight filtered through the hazy sky and the sound of owls rose from the surroundings, Alice took her first step outside the house very carefully, without making a sound. Petronilla's eyes held fear, sorrow, and pain. Her maid would not accompany her on this path. She would be alone. Her small footsteps echoed through the cold, misty, and frightening stone streets, dancing with the shadows. On the map Alice had prepared beforehand, there were secret paths. Using these paths and the dilapidated doors, she finally reached the borders of Kilkenny. Every corner, every shadow seemed to test her intelligence, but she had calculated every move in advance. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The darkness of the night and the cold of the city had become her only companions. "No chain can reach my mind," she whispered to herself. These words were a challenge, both to herself and to the enemies she had left behind. With the first rays of the morning sun, a faint light appeared on the misty horizon. Alice was tired, but nevertheless set off towards England with determined steps. With each step she took, the burden of the life she had left behind, that responsibility, lifted from her shoulders. Despite the city she had left behind, her wealth, her fame, the betrayal of her stepchildren, and most painfully, her loyal servant Petronilla, who had been left to suffer torture, she had saved her freedom and her life. There was a bitter sadness within her, but she knew that to live, or rather to try to live, meant to fight. Her escape quickly spread from mouth to mouth in Kilkenny. In the markets, inns, and churchyards, people whispered to each other, Alice was a witch. She fled in fear of accusations and trial. That woman broke her chains. Some began to call her the devil's helper, while others saw her as a woman stronger than any man. Fear and admiration became two sides of the same story. As time passed, Alice's name became a shadow, a legend. Some called her a master of dark magic, while others remembered her intelligence, courage, and stubborn will to survive. The whispers said, a woman wrote her own destiny. The only truth was this: Alice Kyteler was not merely a witch. She was a woman who refused to bow to chains, who used her mind and courage, who clung tightly to her faith and determination. This step she took just before being erased from the pages of history transformed her into much more than an ordinary criminal. Her case went down in history as the first official witch trial in Ireland and even in Europe. Dame Alice Kyteler became a symbol of fear, freedom, and power. For some, a sinner who sold her soul to the devil. For others, a powerful woman who broke the chains of a male-dominated world. Her name was whispered through the generations, filled with both fear and admiration. Even in neighboring cities and countries across the seas, Alice's name was spoken with reverence. To some, she was nothing more than a dark shadow tainted by suspicion and sorcery. For others, she was the echo of hope and resistance, proof that a woman could stand tall against the waves of power seeking to silence her. Yet for everyone who heard her name, one truth remained unchanged. Alice Kyteler had gone down in history as the woman at the center of the first witch trial, and for that reason, her story would never be forgotten for generations to come. On the contrary, it would live on with the legends that time brought. As we approach the end of our story, it is your turn to face Alice's sharp wit and unwavering courage. Close your eyes and let yourself drift into the dusty pages of history. Discover the pieces of this extraordinary legend by feeling them. Listen to her unforgettable story. Even after centuries have passed, think about her resistance and ask yourself, is my determination and strength enough to write my own destiny? But remember, Alice's story is not just history, it is also a warning. Fear and prejudice have the power to enslave entire societies. They can distort justice, silence voices, and extinguish lives in the blink of an eye. Her story reminds us how important and fragile freedom can be, and what must be sacrificed to protect it. So what do you think? If you were in that cold, ruthless courtroom, would you stand up like Alice and defend yourself, rejecting all charges? Or would silence swallow you like a nightmare? If your survival depended on being smarter than those around you, would you succeed and choose life, or would you fail and remain buried forever in the dusty pages of history? And now it's your turn. Which legendary witch should we bring to light next? Shall we uncover Isabel Gowdie's unforgettable confessions in Scotland, or follow the mysterious path of Irish healer Biddy Hurley? Share your choice in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Like and click the bell so you don't miss future stories. Every story we bring to life carries the whispers of a past that is dark, unforgettable, but infinitely fascinating. By joining us, you become part of a community that keeps these forgotten voices alive and gives them a space to be heard once more. Until next time, let the shadows guide your curiosity, and may the legends linger in your mind long after the story ends. See you in Whispers of Legends.